Hey friends, welcome to Creating the Future, where we're going to dive into stories and truths and some deep questions. They're going to help you shape your faith and, of course, your future. I get the privilege of being your host. My name is Dr. Brent Simpson, and today we are going to explore the fascinating and often sometimes controversial topic of where the word Easter actually comes from. And more importantly, even, should we be using the word Easter when it comes to this season, or should we be using the words Resurrection Day instead? Now, this is a topic that comes up a lot this time of year, and there's always a lot of misinformation floating around. Some of it's driven by good intentions, and let's be honest, some of it not so much. So in this episode, I want to give you the truth, the historical scholarship, the linguistic evidence that's out there, and the theological significance of all of it. So stick with me over the next few moments, and by the end of this episode, you're going to be able to make an informed decision on whether or not you should use the word Easter or Resurrection Day, and you might even be able to help some other people make that decision as well. All right, everybody, welcome back. All right, let's start this conversation with theories behind the term Easter or the word Easter. And let's start with that most basic of questions. Where did the term Easter come from? Now, one popular theory that you might have heard is that the word Easter derives from a supposed pagan goddess named Eostre or Ostera. We'll use Eostre for this one because that's where the terms linguistically seem to match each other. And it's a goddess associated with the spring and fertility. This idea is largely, if not completely, primarily attributed to the 8th century monk, a guy by the name of Bede. He's referred to as the Venerable Bede, if you look him up in history. And he wrote a book that we would refer to now as The Reckoning of Time. It's actually called De Temporum Rationae. And in the book, he refers to this idea of this goddess. In fact, I quote from the book when I say, Eostre Manath has a name which is now translated as Paschal month, and which was once called after a goddess of theirs named Eostre, and whose honored feasts were celebrated in that month. So you can see right here, it's very clear. Bede says that according to him, the month of April was called Eostre Manath, and that's where we get the Old English term Estra or Esther, and Estra was this god. Esther was this goddess of fertility and such. And the Christians celebrated Christ's resurrection in that month as well. So the Christians took on Esther's name and eventually changed it to Easter and brought that into Christianity. And so you can see it pretty clearly right there, right? Well, not quite so fast, because there's actually no direct evidence outside of Bede's own account that such a goddess of Eostre ever even existed. This leads scholars to really debate back and forth what's going on here with Bede, because there's no other evidence of this goddess anywhere. What's going on here? And it can't be overstated that Bede is the primary source of this claim. And after Bede, you get other people quoting him, but nobody's ever quoting or talking about Eostre prior to this. So this leads to a great scholarly debate. Let's see if we can unpack it a little bit of what's going on here. So many scholars nowadays believe that Bede's account doesn't reflect actual historical worship of this goddess Eostre. In fact, in the book Stations of the Sun by Dr. Ronald Hutton, a historian of British paganism and folklore, he writes this. Now, this is the expert talking. He says, there is no evidence outside of Bede for the goddess Eostre, and no archaeological finds, inscriptions, or folk traditions that can verify her existence. Now, that's very important. Now, Hutton goes on to talk about that Bede might have maybe extrapolated this idea a little bit, or even invented the goddess to explain the name of the month. Nobody knows if that's true or not, but it is very important to note that the only historical source mentioning this goddess of Eostre is Bede himself. There is no archaeological or literary evidence that confirms widespread worship of such a goddess. Now, in today's world, that's led many scholars to believe that Bede may have misrepresented this, or at minimum exaggerated the connection between this goddess and the month. Because if a month is named after a goddess, there should be other people talking about that as well. In fact, Dr. Carol Cusack, a professor of religious studies at the University of Sydney, she says it this way in her research. She says, Bede's testimony is solitary and uncorroborated. The epistemological connection between Eostre and Eostre, listen to me, is plausible linguistically, but not historically substantiated. Now, this is important because linguistically, these two words sound alike. So you and I can hear this, and it can be pretty obvious to us. Well, clearly, it looks like Eostre came from this word, Eostre. But it's important that a lot of words sound alike that aren't necessarily actually alike. And so this particular professor says it's plausible linguistically, but not historically substantiated. Now, that's important. And it leads to the question, now, what do most historians believe? Now, here's the thing that most historians believe. They believe that the word Eostre actually comes from a linguistic root of an old English word and a Germanic word of Ostern. And Ostern, in the way words go and they pass down, Ostern actually comes from a word of albus, meaning east or dawn. And it's really connecting the early church tradition of resurrection morning, getting up early for resurrection morning with this symbolic rising of the sun at the east and this picture of early in the morning with the dawn. And therefore, they tend to have, the majority of scholars tend to actually believe it's Christian roots going all the way back to albus, which then gets translated into Ostern, which is where we get Easter from. And that's what most scholars tend to believe. Now, I asked ChatGPT, right? Because there's no other great educated person to ask on this subject other than ChatGPT. We got to see what ChatGPT has to say, right? Whatever you take ChatGPT to say, or whatever stock you put into ChatGPT. I asked it, I said, what percentage of historians do you think believe Easter comes from a pagan tradition, and how many comes from a Christian tradition with the term Easter? And ChatGPT estimates that 70 to 80% of historians believe that the word Easter comes from a Christian tradition, and only about 20 to 30% believe it comes from a pagan tradition. So, simply put, and I'm not trying to bother you because I know you might have heard different things and you might have been taught different things all of your life, and I'm not trying to upset the apple cart, so to speak. But according to most historians, the name Easter probably doesn't come from pagan origins. Now, you can get mad at me if you want. All I'm expressing to you is the facts and what historians say, who are not partial either way. They're just trying to look up the evidence. And the simple fact is that most historians do not believe there's strong historical evidence that the Christians intentionally adopted some kind of pagan holiday and rebranded it and turned it into Easter. In fact, as Dr. Tony Reiki talks about, as he writes on the subject, he says, no historical evidence shows that early Christians attempted to synchronize the resurrection with pagan spring rites. Rather, the resurrection was celebrated from the earliest days of the church, rooted deeply in Jewish tradition. Now, here's another one. Dr. Anthony McRoy, a lecturer and expert on Middle Eastern studies, he writes this in his study called "Was Easter Borrowed from a Pagan Holiday?" And he says there is no indication that the naming of Easter involves a conscious Christian adoption of pagan practices. More likely, the term was simply the local name for the season in which the resurrection was celebrated. That's an interesting thing to see. These are the historians. These are not me talking here. So in other words, the word may have been seasonal or regional in its origin, and then it ended up with theological implications later on. Who knows? But let's talk about this. What are the real origins of the idea of the resurrection and Easter and Resurrection Day? Let's talk about the Christian and Hebrew roots of celebrating this. And long before we had English speakers and we used the word Easter, Christians all across the ancient world celebrated the resurrection using another term, Pascha. Pascha, a direct reference to the Passover. The Greek and Latin churches of the 1st and 2nd century and early on, these early churches used this term consistently and connected it with the Passover, deeply rooted obviously in the New Testament. 1 Corinthians 5:7 says, "For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed." And so the early church word was actually something that most of us, in English at least, are not using at all. It's Pascha. Now, in his book, The Origins of the Liturgical Year, historian Thomas Talley points out the early church's celebration of the resurrection grew directly out of Passover observance among Jewish Christians. Now, if you know anything about early church and the early Christian movement, you know that it springs out of this Jewish movement, really. It grew out of what the Jews were already doing. So when we say Resurrection Day or Pascha, we are literally aligning ourselves with the original Jewish Christian context. And in fact, most languages still use that derivative of Pascha today. In fact, if you were French, and forgive me for pronouncing these because I'm not these languages, but if you were French, I believe it's Pasques. If you were Spanish, it's Pascuala. If you were Italian, it's Pasqua. If you were Greek, it's Pascha. But all of those have the original Pascha idea within it. Only a few Germanic languages, such as English and German, use the word Easter today, which again comes from that Eostre word from the German. So now let's take it to the next level. How should Christians respond to this? Should we say Easter? Should we say Resurrection Day? How should we respond? What if we have to wrestle with these things? Because we do in a very real sense. So let's look at it practically and biblically and put it together. If the word comes from a potentially mythical pagan goddess, should Christians use it? Well, Paul writes about these kind of things in Romans chapter 14, verse 5 and 6, and he says, one person considers one day more sacred than another considers every day alike. Each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind. Whoever regards one day as special does so to the Lord. So in other words, if your conscience bothers you by the term Easter, call it Resurrection Day. That is absolutely valid. In fact, it's not just valid, it's beautiful. That's a wonderful thing. But if your heart is focused on the resurrection of Jesus and you use the term Easter, you're not committing some kind of sacred hidden sin that you might not have realized you were committing or what have you. As C.S. Lewis once said, paganism was the childhood of religion. What does that mean? Well, in other words, all cultures grope around with truth until they find it, and they ultimately find it in Christianity. So paganism is oftentimes the flower pot of where Christianity grows out from. And because of that, we don't fear the shadows of the past. We walk in the light of the resurrection of the present. All right, with all that being said, let me just wrap up with a couple of thoughts here as I land the plane. Number one, most historians do not believe Easter was stolen from a pagan festival. While the word may have linguistic ties to ancient times, the celebration of the resurrection is rooted clearly in the observation of the Passover, and the word Easter itself probably isn't pagan in its roots. Therefore, and this is the main reason for this podcast, I would be careful with the sort of proud, prideful way some people are like, I refuse to say Easter, and anybody who does is sinning, and they don't know the roots of the word Easter, and you don't realize that every time you say Easter, you are speaking out a pagan tradition. Well, that could be, but it's probably not. And be careful of that pridefulness that might rise up, because at the end of the day, you could be right, but you also could have the wrong spirit with it, which also makes you wrong. And so just be loving in all of this. And if you feel like you can't say Easter, don't say Easter. If you feel like you can, you're welcome to say it. It's not a big deal. And then secondly, I would say the term Pascha or Resurrection Day is actually the more historically older and more accurate theological term. So it's great to use Resurrection Day. And if that's your tradition, absolutely go for it. Take it a step further and just start talking about Pascha and use it that way. Using the word Easter, number 3, using the word Easter is not sinful or heretical. As long as your heart is fixed on Jesus and his resurrection, you're not violating some scripture or giving into paganism or being pagan in some way or bringing pagan traditions into the church and all of that. So should we say Easter? Well, let me answer it this way. I think it depends on your heart, your conscience, your understanding of history, and what the Holy Spirit is ultimately speaking to you directly. But for now, at least, you can make a good decision with hopefully a little bit more wisdom and maybe a little bit more confidence as well. Now, if you found this episode helpful, I pray that you share it with a friend. Make sure that you like and subscribe. Make sure that you leave me a comment. I'd love to know your thoughts on this subject. But until next time, I'm Dr. Brent Simpson, and this has been Creating the Future.